Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. We're just going to take a couple minutes to let everyone into the room, and then we will begin shortly. Hi, everyone. Welcome. While we're waiting for everyone to join the room, you can feel free to introduce yourself using the chat. Hi, everyone. Welcome. For those of you just coming into the room, we're just waiting a couple of minutes to let everyone in, and then we'll get started. Please feel free to use the chat to introduce yourselves. Welcome, everyone, and nice to see you all today. Just give it another little bit to let a few more people in. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. If you're comfortable, please go ahead and use the chat to introduce yourselves. Nice to see so many people joining. We're just going to give it another little bit. Morning, good afternoon. I always feel like I want to say it's nice to see you all, but I can't see any of you, so I use that in the figurative sense. But it's nice to see so many people. I see the numbers going up. Great to see you all. All right, I think we will go ahead and get started. So welcome, everyone. Welcome to today's panel called Navigating Civic Engagement in Canada, Advocacy, Lobbying, and the Boundaries of Influence. My name is Jodine Baker. I am the Vice President of Research, Advocacy, and External Relations at Imagine Canada, and I will be your moderator for today's discussion. If you end up enjoying today's panel, which I hope you will, and if you aren't already one, we do encourage you to consider becoming an Imagine Canada member. These events are complimentary for our members. And if you would like to learn more about membership, please reach out to us at membership@imaginecanada.ca. I would also like to thank McCarthy Tetro for sponsoring today's panel discussion. It is very appreciated. In Canada, some forms of advocacy are regulated by lobbying rules, while other forms aren't. Today's discussion will focus on the shifting regulatory landscape governing advocacy and lobbying in Canada, and how charities and nonprofits are operating within this environment. Before we begin the panel discussion, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. Imagine Canada's staff, operations, work, and network depend on traditional Indigenous territories to provide us physical space, sustenance, safety, and community to work, live, and play. Our physical head office is located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat and Wyandot nations. We acknowledge that these lands are covered by Treaty 13 and the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, and we acknowledge that these lands are still home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Personally, I'm joining you today from Winnipeg, which is located on Treaty 1 territory and the national homeland of the Red River Métis. I acknowledge that this land is the ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe, Anishinaabe, Ininiwak, Nehethawak, Dakota Oyate, and the Mischief Métis people. We offer this acknowledgement today with gratitude and as a reminder that the work we do, including policy and systems work, takes place within the context of these lands, histories, and ongoing relationships. We recognize that learning and reflection are ongoing responsibilities, and we're committed to approaching this work with respect and humility. Thank you. So today we're going to start with a brief introduction to ways in which charities in Canada can engage in civic discourse, including some reference to the rules in the Income Tax Act, CRA policy, and the Lobbying Act. Our panelists will then weigh in on some questions related to their areas of expertise, and then we will make sure to save some time at the end for questions for all of you. So while the panelists are engaging in the pre-prepared questions that we have, keep an eye on the chat. We'll drop some resources for you in there. And if you do have a question, I'm going to ask that you use the Q&A function in Zoom. So it's at the bottom of the screen on that panel with all the icons. You may need to click on the More button with the 3 dots to get it to show up, but there should be an option that's Q&A. And please type your question in there. That will make it easy for us to find it. They can get lost in the chat. So without further delay, let's get into it. So I'm going to begin to invite our panelists to introduce themselves. Robert, we're going to start with you. So please go ahead and introduce yourself. Oh, Robert, you are on mute, so we'll get that. There we go.
You'd think I would have learned that in the last 5 years, but thanks. Thank you for that, Jodine. I'm Robert Hayhoe. I'm a partner at McCarthy Tétrault, where I lead our charities and nonprofit practice. I have all too extensive experience advising charities and nonprofits on advocacy matters, including defending many of them at the end of the Harper government when charities were being threatened with revocation for too much advocacy. So good to be able to participate in this, and good that we're in a less fraught set of circumstances while we're doing it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Robert. Nicole.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Daou. I'm a partner with Robert in our Charities and Nonprofits group at McCarthy Tétrault. I'm located in Toronto, and je suis franco-ontarienne et je travaille avec des clients dans le domaine de la bienfaisance partout au Canada. So I work with clients in French and English in the charitable sector across Canada. Happy to be here. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Nicole. Next, Prairie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Prairie Chu. I'm the Director of Engagement and Advocacy at Vantage Point. We're a provincial nonprofit in British Columbia that supports other nonprofits. And we're also the convener of the BC Nonprofit Network. Happy to be here today and calling in from traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples.
Thanks, Prairie. And Pamela.
Thanks, Jodine. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see familiar folks in the chat saying hello. My name is Pamela Upal Sandhu. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm from the Ontario Nonprofit Network. Our mission is to connect and strengthen with and for nonprofits across the province. I'm calling in from Treaty 14 territory today, which is in Oakville. It's the head of the Lake Purchase out in Ontario, Western Ontario, I suppose. And really looking forward to having this conversation, quite timely, and looking forward to sharing space with fellow panelists.
Thank you. I'm so happy to have you all here and looking forward to our conversation today. To begin, I'm going to start with you, Robert. Can I invite you to provide some introductory comments around today's topic?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. My thesis for today is that each charity has not just an opportunity to consider and to participate in advocacy up to and including lobbying. I think that each charity has an obligation to consider its advocacy platform. We should frankly consider it unusual if a charity isn't engaged in advocacy and lobbying. A charity, by definition, is a purpose-driven organization. Each of your organizations exists for no purpose, for no reason other than to drive social change. The definition, it's definitional, it's axiomatic that charities create social change. And social change doesn't happen by spending money. Social change happens by making a point, convincing people of it. And that applies to convincing members of the public as well as to convincing government, our different levels of government. From a sort of strictly legal perspective, a charity and its directors and its senior management are all subject to a fiduciary duty to advance the charity's purposes, whatever those purposes might be, to advance those charitable purposes using all of the resources at the charity's disposal. In many cases, a charity's most valuable resource it would not be its money. Its most valuable resource in many cases would be the voice of the charity and the people that make it up. My view, therefore, is that your charities have a positive legal and legally enforceable duty to speak up to the public and the government where it would be helpful. You know, the other panelists will expand on this, but there aren't really charity law restrictions on your ability to speak up anymore. There used to be. I referred to the sort of witch hunt that happened at the end of the last Harper government, that was an attempt by the government to impose very strict and to some extent made up tax law limits on charities. Those limits are no longer, if they ever existed, and I would suggest they ought not to have been thought to exist even then, but if they ever existed, they don't exist now. Absent an in-process election, which we obviously don't have at this point, charities are permitted to speak to government. There are lobbying rules that we will hear about, but subject to lobbying rules and subject to very small limits on partisan political activity, charities can and should speak on everything. And so that's my rant to start us off.
That's helpful. I would not characterize that as a rant, Robert. Thank you so much. I think that was a great way to set the stage. I really liked your framing of this as a responsibility of charities, and really loved that comment around like what our most valuable resource is. I know we've been talking lots about just that role of charities in that space around that connective tissue between what's actually happening in the lives of Canadian and the decisions that are being made by the federal government. So thank you for that. I'm now going to go over to Nicole with a question. So many in charities and nonprofits do want to engage in public policy discussions, but they're unsure about the rules, or they're hesitant about this idea of registering as a lobbyist. So what should organizations understand about the different rules that apply to advocacy and government relations activities, including lobbying rules? And how can organizations that may be hesitant to register as lobbyists still participate in policy discussions and engage with government while remaining compliant?
Sure. Thank you, Jodine. So in answering that question, I want to make 3 points. And the first one is I really want to empower everyone on the call today to understand the buckets of legal rules that apply when you're engaging in public policy work. And I'm not going to define what I mean by public policy work, because I think as I explain it, it will become clear. So we're going to talk about the categories of legal rules that you need to be thinking about. You don't need to understand all the details, and you'll see. But if you know what the buckets are, you should be in good shape. Then I'm going to give specific examples to try to make it practical for you. And then on the third point I want to make is for the people on the call who are more seasoned in the advocacy and public policy space, who feel they understand the Canadian rules or have a good understanding of them, give you a little bit of advanced perspective on what we're seeing in the US, just to add some more technical and to make possibly some new content for people to consider for those of you who are joining that will be a refresher for you. Okay, so we're going to talk about those buckets of legal rules, and you might hear, there's lots of resources out there about charities and advocacy, what you can and can't do. The way you might see it typically described as there are 2 or 3 ways that charities can engage in public policy discussions, and actually, CRA has said in the past that through their public call line, this is one of the most commonly asked questions that they get. Okay, so what can we do? What kind of advocacy? And part of that is there's a lot of terminology. Some have legal concepts, some are concepts that are developed in the policy documents, some are just industry terms that we use. So you'll hear often, we can do unlimited mission advocacy, unlimited public policy dialogue and development activities, and a strict prohibition on partisan political activity. So all of that stuff that you hear is really one of the 3 buckets that we're going to talk about. That's all the Income Tax Act rules and CRA policy. And I'm going to, with all those terms, and that's why CRA gets a lot of calls about that, because there's just a lot there. But we advise clients about this all the time, and I'm going to try to simplify by giving you the advice that I give my clients around the compliance with the Income Tax Act and CRA policy. And then the 2 other buckets are the Lobbying Act rules. Okay, and then there's Election Act rules. When the writ drops and you're in an election period, there's a whole other set of rules that we need to be thinking about. So those are the 3 buckets. And practically to sort of situate yourselves in those 3 buckets when it comes to the Income Tax Act compliance, that's our wheelhouse. We'll talk a little bit later when we get into Lobbying and Elections Act. Those are highly specialized areas of law. Where our clients come to us and they say, there's an election coming up. We're thinking about doing this campaign. Can you have someone look at it to see if the language is compliant, or do we have obligations around that? We bring in other people on our team to support clients in that regard. So we have Income Tax Act, CRA, Lobbying, and Elections Act rules. Our wheelhouse, as I said, is the ITA and CRA compliance. What we understanding all those terms, like for me, I find the best advice I can give to clients. Ideally, everyone understands what a PDA is and what an advocacy is and what, but at the end of the day, when you're working with those rules, I think the more relevant question to ask is, what are we not allowed to do? And once you get a really good sense of what you're not allowed to do, you start to see all the things that you can do. And Robert and I were chatting this morning. The regime is actually super permissive. Okay, so my golden rule for clients is you just can't be partisan. So when you hear PDAs and advocacy and the prohibition on partisan, I advise clients spend more time understanding what does it mean to be partisan, because that is what we know is strictly prohibited. And if you invest time there, you start to see all the rest comes into place, because really, whether you call something a PDA or advocacy or anything like, it's all the other things that you do to engage your supporters, your donors, the general public around your mission and your charitable purposes. So understanding that partisan prohibition is where I feel clients is the most valuable place to spend your time. If there's that line that you're drawing in the sand. The other big rule is you don't need a charitable purpose to do all of these things, right? You don't need a political purpose to do all of these things. So there's a trend now where we see a lot of charities that only do advocacy, but they don't. If you look at their legal documents, it's not saying we carry on political blah, blah, blah. That's prohibited, right? You need a purpose. So for example, a charity might have a purpose to advance education by giving scholarships and supporting post-secondary education. And all they do is they might give scholarships, but they do a ton of advocacy around how to make the education system more affordable for young people and so that can be a whole big part of what they do. And if not the predominant thing that they do in furtherance of a traditional charitable purpose to advance education. And so that's all the CRA piece, the CRA ITA piece, the partisan thing, spend time on that. When we get into the lobbying rules, how you're triggered to get in where okay, we have all of these rules around partisan. How do we know when we might be subject to Lobbying Act rules? That's where you go from just a public call to action supporting your donors, or engaging your donor supporters through your website, through public awareness campaigns, through policy position papers, all of that work that you do. When you go from just that public engagement to actually engaging with the government office holder and official, that's where you have to say to yourself, we may have to look at the lobbying rules. Do we have to register? Are we exempt? What are the rules that apply? But that's the trigger. When you go from your public facing communications to directly engaging with government, the light bulb should be, do we have a Lobbying Act registration requirement? And then the third piece is the electioneering. So right when the writ drops, there's rules around third-party advertising. So if you have a policy position that can be attributed with a platform of a candidate, you might have to register as a third-party advertiser. So those are the three buckets, and they're all different regimes. And the terminology is kind of sort of conflated between all three of them. But if you think about them in three separate things, it helps you understand how to be compliant, because you might say, okay, we're compliant on the ITA, CRA side, we're not partisan, but we are engaging government, and have we sought advice on whether we need to be registered as lobbyists or not, because we're directly communicating with public office holders. So those are the three things. I don't want to take up too much time. I know I might be cutting in a little bit, pushing my time limit a little bit, but I promise to give you some specific examples, and I have a little bit already. But what I would say is the CRA policy on what's prohibited, the difficulty is the very explicitly partisan things are pretty obvious, right? You're not funding a political party. You're not calling out specific candidates for their platforms or voting records. And all of that is pretty clear on CRA policy. So all the things that are strictly prohibited are quite obvious. There's a lot of gray, right? Because there's a lot of nuance in this area. But what I would say is that all of the things I alluded to, your position papers, your research papers, your public awareness campaigns, specifically advocating for laws, changes in laws and policies in a nonpartisan manner. And it could be as simple as, rather than saying, the Liberal government has failed on this, or this particular government, you say just the government, the new legislation that's being put forward is not helpful to our organization for XYZ reasons. And suddenly you've taken something, it's the same message, it's the same advocacy, but you've taken the partisan piece out of it, and therefore, you're free to do that kind of work with confidence that you're not contravening any of the ITA and CRA policy rules. So that's the three buckets, like giving a little bit of examples. And then the last piece I would say is I wanted to talk quickly about the US policy environment. And I thought this would be really interesting. I find this interesting. I hope you do too. We were just in Washington for the American Bar Association conference, talking to our charity law counterparts in the US. And there's a new bill in the US, and people who are involved in donor advised funds and fiscal sponsor organizations might be interested in this. But there's a new bill called the Sponsor Act, and it basically is being put forward in the House of Commons in the US, and it's contemplating that donor advised funds and fiscal sponsors will have criminal and civil liability for the programs that they carry out through their programs that are carried out through their grantees. So it's created quite a stir, and we attended a panel with US lawyers and the IRS, so their version of our Canada Revenue Agency, where the US lawyer said to the IRS, you realize that if this bill goes through, you're going to see people take to the streets. Like there's going to be peaceful, she was very polite to say, there's going to be peaceful protests, but you're going to get protests. And I spoke with her after, and I thought it was very interesting because she talked about how the sector is engaged in a very grassroots kind of way. There are a lot of protests, and it made me think about how we engage government in Canada and what the opportunities are. And it's very interesting because we are in a policy environment right now with vis-a-vis the CRA and finance where, and I'm not the only one to say this, but they're less receptive to the sector at this time. And that's for a lot of different reasons. They're like all of us, they're being asked to do more with less money. And that brings challenges for compliance and customer service and their ability to respond to our ideas and advance the law and regulatory environment for the entire sector. So it made me think, like, I know Jodine and you and I have talked about this, thinking of how can we engage in new and creative and impactful ways, and learning about how they're engaging in the US. And the US also has its challenges in that a lot of organizations are stepping out of the policy spotlight because of a lot of executive orders are afraid of being investigated. But there is still this traditional kind of grassroots movement of sector protests and people really protesting and letting the government know in a peaceful way, of course, how they think about legislation and policy. And I thought that would be interesting to bring to you today so that we can hopefully inject some new ideas into how we're engaging the government and the public generally around advocacy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nicole. That was a lot of information, but all very clearly explained. I appreciated how you built on, Robert's point around, like, it's the responsibility of chair. Like, this is an opportunity we have to engage with government, and your focus on, look at what isn't allowed, and then that will make you more comfortable in engaging in those activities. And thanks for sharing that US example as well. Really fascinating. We're going to turn now our focus to the provincial level. And so I'm going to start with a question to Prairie. So how are British Columbia's lobbying rules affecting the nonprofit sector? And what should organizations be paying attention to as they navigate advocacy and compliance?
Thank you, Jodine. Thank you for having the team for having me here and Vantage Point's perspective on this. Happy to start first here in the West. I think a lot of folks on the call are, maybe charities. And so, thinking about the fact that, many of you are probably considering, what the federal requirements are, but also thinking about the jurisdictions, the provincial jurisdictions or municipalities even that you're doing lobbying in and what those requirements are. So currently in BC, the requirements around lobbying registration are much more comprehensive than the federal requirements, both in terms of registration with our provincial registrar of lobbyists and also what's sort of reportable and considered lobbying. These requirements have really become a significant administrative burden for nonprofits here in British Columbia, especially those that are smaller. There is currently a exemption for a certain size of organization that fall under a certain number of hours in the previous 12 months around lobbying related activities. But they also need to not have a mandate to do advocacy of any kind, which includes representing membership, the interests and needs of membership. And so, as Robert pointed out, this poses a challenge for many of us because, I think there's always some aspect of sharing sharing, what we're hearing from membership or the folks we serve, or, those kind of that kind of drive, that's behind sort of our mission. So I will give a little example. I don't want to delve too much into the reporting requirements and the registration requirements here, but in terms of sort of broader activities that are considered lobbying in BC, here different forms of communication with public office holders, such as social media, phone calls, meeting coordination over email, are reportable. Lobbying activities, as well as funding from sources even beyond the province. These are reportable here under our regiment. That really differs from what currently, charities have to do for nonprofits have to do federally in terms of, very much more of a simple, clear kind of definition of what is lobbying activity. I think one of the things you're asking, Jodine, is, what has been the impact of this on our nonprofits here? I think we've noticed here that it's had a real chilling effect on how nonprofits here engage with their elected officials and government contacts and partners. In 2025, we conducted a survey on our Lobbyist Transparency Act, and 75% of our respondents agreed that the requirements impact their overall ability to effectively engage with our provincial government to advance their mission. And it really is sort of deterring that engagement currently. There are some additional pieces around this sort of what's, sort of how the dynamic has sort of unfolded here. Our Office of the Registrar of Lobbyists, which is responsible for enforcement of our Lobbyist Transparency Act, has the role of meting out fines and penalties to nonprofits that are non-compliant. And although the number of organizations they've fined has been very low in proportion to those that they've supported and provided guidance to, they're very accessible. You can call them and ask questions and receive that guidance. The fact that some of these organizations that have been penalized were high profile, or we're all very connected in our sector, so we hear about it, or we kind of when we kind of see that, it's really contributed to the fear and uncertainty within our sector around engaging. One of the nice things that's one of the windows of opportunity, I think, that we've had as a sector here in BC around this is 2025 was our year of formally reviewing our Lobbyist Transparency Act. And so the province just concluded their review, and in April last month, released their recommendations from the special committee that reviewed this act around ways to kind of change and improve the act. And we were really hopeful and glad to see that a lot of our sector's concerns were reflected in those recommendations. And so very much looking forward to continuing to work with government out here to improve the act so that it's sustainable for nonprofits, especially the majority, which are smaller, mid-sized nonprofits, so that it also brings some clarity around what's reportable and what's not, and support compliance. So I know that maybe I'll sort of wrap things up a little there, but I know that for those that are interested, I think that your team has shared another webinar that we're doing, which is much more of a deep dive into like the legal requirements around the Lobbyist Transparency Act that'll be taking place next Wednesday on the 27th. And I think also to share where you can find more information about the requirements, the website that you can go to.
Great. Thanks so much, Prairie. And as you said at the intro, it's just for charities, it's interesting that they need to think about how they're functioning when they're lobbying to the federal government, or those activities, as well as at the provincial and, as you said, municipal level. I know at Imagine Canada, we were keeping an eye out on BC, and we're also hopeful to see the report that came out in April, and links a little bit to Nicole, what you're saying around that, the grassroots movement, and how there is that value in speaking up when something is happening at the government level that is impeding the sector's ability to engage in that civic discourse.
Maybe I'll
Um,
just quickly
yeah, go
add
ahead.
that there's a fine pause and penalty pause out in BC right now until September 30th. So it's a really good time to learn about this act and your responsibilities under it. Thanks for letting me
We
add that.
won't go so far as saying now's a good time to test your limits. We won't go that far.
No,
A
no.
good time to continue to learn about
Yes,
that. So
yes.
perfect. Thanks, Prairie. Pamela, over to you. Given your experience working with nonprofits in Ontario, how has the advocacy environment evolved over the years? And what are you hearing? Like, have you heard any concerns about how advocacy is being affected by either provincial or federal lobbying rules?
Thanks, Jodine. I'll try my best to answer your question. I've been in the space for about 10 years, so that's kind of where I'm bringing my lens. In many ways, not much has changed, and then in other ways, a lot has changed. And that's kind of what I'll speak to today. If I can leave you with, or the audience with, three messages, I would reiterate Robert's initial message around the importance of nonprofits and charities being part of public policy dialogue, both from in terms of furthering our charitable purposes or missions, but also being that bridge between government and communities, right? Our responsibility to elevate voices of communities. I'd also reiterate Nicole's point about understanding the rules, and really making decisions based that are not fear-based and assumption-based, but based on what are the rules, what do they require, and sort of systematically reviewing your public policy activities to determine where you fall, right? Do you need to register? Do you not? Is this lobbying? Is this advocacy? Whatever it might be. And so the way that I just wanted to like begin the conversation is maybe just in contrast to Prairie's comments, Ontario's lobbying rules are similar to the federal ones, I would say. There was significant changes to the rules back in 2014, where we used to have, if you're a staff person does more than 20% of their work as lobbying, in a 3-month period, you have to register. And then in 2014, that changed to 50 hours a year, which is less than an hour a week. And the definition for lobbying became much more broader. A lot more stuff sort of was captured in it. Again, sort of similar to what the threshold rules that we're seeing at the federal level. At the same time, one of like in doing our state of the sector survey every year, we've been asking about advocacy. So our latest data shows from 2025 that 59% of nonprofits say that it's really important for them to increase their level of participation in public policy dialogue. So we know there's more appetite to do public policy advocacy, whether that's individually as organizations in a grassroots sort of way Nicole's talking about, or collectively in like coalitions, etc. And then we also asked, it was right before the election year, I think. And we asked, are you doing any advocacy work right now? 93% of our respondents said they were engaging some sort of advocacy work at the time. So again, I think that's one of the things that has changed. Many more nonprofits sort of see it as part of their role, charities see it as part of their role to advance their mission, support their communities, and perhaps just the state of our communities that we're in right now. There's a lot of advocacy happening, whether that's individually or collectively. The other thing that we've noticed is that more and more organizations are doing advocacy at all three levels. And when I say all three levels, I'm saying federal, provincial in our case, and even at the municipal level. Just over the last year, we've seen so many cross-jurisdictional issues pop up. And we've seen, the feds with the province with local municipalities, tabling legislation. So there's a lot going on. So you could have one nonprofit or charity who has a federal issue that they're advancing, a provincial issue on many ways that they're advancing, and then a very local issue that they're advancing with a regional council or a city council. And so that goes back to my point with Nicole, really knowing what level you're advocating at on what issue and what the rules are really important because here in Ontario, some municipalities don't have lobby registry rules, some do. And so to really know what your sort of playground is for that. The other piece that we've seen is that, and it goes to your question around evolving, there's so much turnover in the sector, so much has changed, right? And so Robert sort of began comments about talking about the end of Harper years. A lot of those people aren't necessarily around in the sector in the same way like they were, right? There's a lot of leadership turnover, there's a lot of board member turnover, and so good and bad ways. We're losing institutional knowledge, but we're also gaining a lot of folks that want to do advocacy, that want to further, and perhaps weren't part of that advocacy chill that might have appeared in the beginning or during Harper years and beyond that. And which also means that we need to do a lot more work as intermediaries across, coast to coast to coast around what these rules are, what do they mean? Because there's always hesitancy of what the rules are and sort of misinformation circling around that. And then maybe what hasn't changed or what we continue to hear is the administrative burden that's always there when you have to do all of this, right? So, of course, we're a public policy shop. It's part of our work to figure out what the rules are and to do advocacy. So it's built into our time, but I'm very conscious that there are a lot of small to medium-sized organizations in our sector who don't have the same capacity. And so to really take that time to figure out, am I lobbying? Am I not? How much time am I spending? Takes a lot of effort, right? And just to give you an example, at the federal, with the new federal sort of threshold changes and all of that, what's been really good is that you don't really have to track if you are under the threshold. You kind of just got to track if you meet the threshold, right? In Ontario, you should probably track all of it, even if you're not meeting it, just in case there's a complaint and you sort of have to show proof like, hey, I actually didn't go above the threshold. So that's something to keep in mind, right? And again, if you're advocating on various issues at different levels, you kind of need to have a grasp of everything so you can make those informed decisions and review your public policy activities. So the admin burden is still there. I myself was registering at the federal level, and at the end of it, after like 3 tries or putting stuff in, I was told just delete your registration. You don't need to register. And so I think I share that in the spirit of you don't need to have it figured out, right? You can make mistakes. You can sort of, especially at the federal level, what we've heard over and over again, it's not about being punitive, but it really is about compliance and ensuring compliance. That necessarily is not the case in other jurisdictions. So of course, to keep that in mind as well. The other piece of information or sort of thought that I wanted to share was in some past research, we've found that the biggest predictor of nonprofits and charities advocating is support from funders. Philanthropy being the biggest, like non-governmental funders being a very, very big predictor of that. So if the funder is doing advocacy themselves, their grantees are much more likely to do advocacy. If the funder funds advocacy, even better, right? Because there are not a lot of pots of money out there that support advocacy work, whether like just a part of it or support organizations that primarily do advocacy work. Or that, may not fund it or provide or do funding for themselves, but even they give money to the organization, they're not overbearing and saying, if you do any advocacy, even if it's not with our money, we're not going to support you. So a huge, huge indicator and a huge role for non-governmental funders to play in that space. We are hearing just a little bit concern, more than the rules, I would say. I think the rules at all levels, it's sort of like, you can figure out what you shouldn't do, what you can do, what you can't do. But what really gets people worried is when their funding's in jeopardy. And if there's funders out there, whether non-governmental, whether regional funders, whatever they might be, who are stipulating clauses in their grant agreements that are overtly sort of, stifling advocacy or inadvertently stifling advocacy, that is going to cause a huge chill. That does cause a huge chill. So we're definitely hearing some of those pieces. And again, capacity. There's not a lot of capacity in the sector to sort of go through that, right? So sometimes, do you risk your $100,000 grant you get every year, or do you do advocacy? That could be a really, really tough decision for folks. So unfortunately, those kinds of things are persisting. And maybe the last comment that I'll leave on that I think is on the side of something that maybe it has changed. Again, my limited scope of 10 years, is this idea of the partisan activities that Nicole was talking about. I think in a polarized climate, in a very like sort of right wing, left wing kind of world where we only live in binaries or the political spectrum is very binary, it can get really hard to determine if the issues that your communities care about and that you're elevating are partisan or not. Right? Especially during election moments, which again, we had talked about, a lot of issues that the sector cares about can quickly become platform issues or quickly become political issues. And in those spaces, especially during elections, what do you do, right? That can be a very gray area, and there's no handbook, there's no rules, there's nothing around that really can give guidance around what's going to happen. So that's something that we're mindful of and thinking about and how to support the sector through that. Yeah, I'll pause there. Those were some initial thoughts I had.
Thank you so much, Pamela. There were so many great pieces of information in there as well. So before we go to the Q&A portion of today's panel, I do have a question for all of you. So a quick roundtable. So this is a 1 hour panel discussion, not much time to really get into it. And we've already shared a lot of information. We've talked about, the need, the responsibility, the opportunity for charities and nonprofits to engage in advocacy and engagement with government. We've talked about administrative burden associated with it. We've talked about the complexity potentially of trying to understand the rules. So a lot of information today. So just wondering in our roundtable, the question is, what's one piece of information that you would like people, our audience, people who are attending today, what's that one piece of information that you really want them to take away from today's discussion? Nicole, I will start with you.
Sure, and I was just responding to putting a little something in the chat about the point that you just made, Pamela, about how do you in an elect like what in the polarized political climate, how do we make sure we're not being partisan? And I have some thoughts on that I'll put in the chat. But one thing I think might be helpful, and I think if you're a small organization, even touching upon Pamela's point about if you know what the capacity to do advocacy, grants and things at risk. If you're a small organization and this is something that you're not doing but you want to get into, my favorite form of advocacy, if you will, is CRA calls it in their policy providing expert testimony. And I think a lot of grassroots, smaller organizations, they think, oh, we need to be engaging, we need to be doing advocacy, but they fail to remember that they actually have all the underlying data and information and testimony about what beneficiaries need, people in need, like what they're working on the ground with organizations. And if they can find, I think someone used the word coalition, maybe it was you, Pamela, if they can find other organizations that are doing the advocacy, the underlying information and data and research and an actual practical experience that they have, like start thinking about that as being your invaluable offering, right? Like you have those organizations are on the ground working and they have a lot of experience. So finding a way to package that in a way that maybe another organization can use to support their advocacy efforts on a particular platform position is an amazing thing that I think we need to see more of.
That's great. Thanks, Nicole. Prairie, what about you?
Oh, wow. One takeaway or one sort of thing to kind of pay attention to. I think it definitely can be very confusing. I think a lot of our experiences is, when folks first hear about these requirements, there's understandably a lot of concern and some panic too sometimes. And I think the assurance that you're not alone. There are sort of we can kind of connect and collaborate and partner with each other as a sector to work through these things. I think that this webinar is one example of that. But there are resources, there are firms, there are organizations that can help you navigate, not just through the formal kind of registrar's office. There are, organizations that have much more experience that you can partner with. So there are always kind of parts of the sector that are willing to kind of help support, increase capacity around this, even just to understand, sort of more the nuance of some of these requirements and regulations. So not to be disheartened, and yes, please, like I think the importance of still doing the advocacy on behalf of the communities and people that you serve and your members is so important. I think the last thing we want is for our sector to kind of step away from that important role that we have in the development of public policy because of because of requirements that maybe we could also engage more with, just to make sure that those requirements also keep us in mind and work for us too. So that's a process, but that just does mean stepping forward and not stepping back. So please reach out to any and all of, your colleagues and networks. And there's always an organization that has a lot more experience around that. So, and definitely we're all here to help.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Prairie. And Pamela?
Honestly, I don't know if I would add anything. The 2 points that I wanted to say were covered by Prairie and Nicole, like, making informed decisions, like really understanding the rules, that being just so important. So you're making a decision based on information versus fear. And then maybe just adding to Prairie's point that there is a lot of support out there, especially in a network way, is if you're an ED, if there's one thing you can do is to talk to your board, really like get your board on side, whether that is, if you're not doing that work, you're not doing any advocacy work right now, work your board up to that, especially before election times. Once the writ drops, that's not a good time to go to the board to say, hey, we should be doing some advocacy work. So really, if you're thinking about initial steps in terms of a plan, think of like the 2 to 3 year runway where you can really coach your board and then make it the culture of the organization where advocacy is part and parcel of your mission. And again, train your directors and your managers or frontline staff. Advocacy is so rich. Government relations can be so rich if everyone in the organization is part of it. If you're getting, linking between what your frontline workers are seeing on the ground in terms of what's showing up to their door, all the way up to your directors and the ED doing that work, it'll just be that much stronger. And more transition planning, more succession planning. So advocacy culture doesn't just die with, the one ED or the one board chair.
Thanks, Pamela. Robert, anything you wanted to add?
I would just reiterate that you can do way more of this than you think you can, and you should do it.
Great, thank you. I love that. I love that as the anchor point. You can do more than you might think that you can do. So we do have a few questions, so I'm going to get into those. I will just pose the question and invite our panelists to unmute and jump in if you feel prepared to answer it. So I'm not going to trust myself to decide in advance who should answer it. There was one that I'm going to start with this one. I know, Robert, you already provided some context to it, but just so that it's in the recording. We had the question, someone wanted to know the panel's thoughts on the persistent hesitancy to engage, especially for organizations that receive significant amounts of government funding, due to a perception that criticism may impact funding decisions. And some context, in my experience, there's even more uncertainty regarding this perceived risk than concerns about CRA rules and charitable status. Robert, I'll echo, Robert did provide some context, a legal answer, and there are more considerations than legal ones. But the legal answer would be that a charity should take into account possible threats to funding in scoping its advocacy activity. That said, if more of us engaged in advocacy, it would protect us all. Just wondering if any of the panelists wanted to add any thoughts to that question around the hesitancy coming from perceived risk to government funding that they may or may not receive.
I can jump in quickly from the Ontario lens to add to that. I wouldn't say it's perceived. I think in some ways it is real for folks, right? We're in a time where revenues are not increasing for nonprofits and charities across the board. And so if you have a sizable grant from government, and you want to do advocacy, that's going to be a big decision, big factor that influences your decision. So not perceived, really real. But I think that's kind of where to point to intermediaries and networks, coalitions, doing it together versus doing it individually, advocacy work, really, really makes a big difference in that space.
Great. Thanks, Pam. All right, I'll move on to the next question. I've got about 6 more waiting, so I'll keep it moving along. Someone had asked, and Nicole, this may be you, can you give an example of an activity that would warrant a registration as a third-party advertiser through the Election Act that wouldn't be considered prohibited partisan activities by the Income Tax Act?
I think I'd have to think about that. It's a highly specialized area of law. I've written on this in the past, particularly because we get a lot of questions around it when there are election periods. But I think in some, the Election Act rules are around, and again, this is stepping outside of my wheelhouse. We would bring in someone on our team that specializes in this area, but it's that question of, is your policy position that you're talking about during an election period, can it be attributable to the platform position of a candidate? Mm-hmm. And I put some information in there in the chat about, from a CRA ITA standpoint, it's a fact-based test. So, for example, if there's a policy position that you've taken for years or a version of it, your organization and a candidate for office happens to take that position and adopt it as their platform, that doesn't automatically make you partisan. You have a demonstrated history of the things you stand for as your organization. And that actually goes to the point that Pamela was raising, like having a culture of advocacy, so that when you do get when you jump in the arena, you have a history of what your positions are and so you can defend yourself if anything, there were any issues around whether you should have registered and you didn't and things like that. So that's what I could think of on that point.
Great, thank you. And the next question, with the provincial and federal remarks, so talking about the different jurisdictions, how do you know which applies to you? So is it where you are registered, federal versus provincial, or is it, where you are physically located?
It's really about what government you're talking to.
Yeah, and like issue based, like if you're doing immigration, let's say you're talking about IRCC or immigration policy, that's most likely going to be towards the federal government. So you would register at the federal level in regards to that issue. But if in Ontario, if you're talking about, let's say, social assistance, that's going to be at the provincial level, so you'll register there. At the municipal level, if your municipality or your region has lobby rules, it would be something that you're talking directly to regional council or city council.
Thank you. The next question. So aside from reporting requirements and the potential impact on funding decisions that we just talked about, what disadvantages are there to registering as a lobbyist?
Well, there are journalists who track through the lobbying registrations and could potentially write articles that are critical of you for being your organization lobbying. Um, I think that the best answer to that is to, if that happens, respond, of course we're lobbying because that's an important way of driving the social change that we exist to drive.
Thanks. I think that what I'm also sensing is that there, aren't significant disadvantages to registering aside from, as acknowledged, the reporting that might come along with it and, considering the potential impacts to funding.
Can I just jump in quickly,
Yeah.
Jane? I was reading some historical documents at ONN when the initial sort of changes to Lobbying Act happened back in like 2014, 2016. And one of the things that I read, which I found really interesting, I think it was a letter we wrote to government at the time, was, if we're registered as lobbyists, our donors aren't going to understand. The public isn't going to understand. I think that's kind of what Robert was saying. Our funders aren't going to understand. And it'll sort of be seen as like, why would a nonprofit or a charity be lobbying? That's not part of your work. But I think because we've made so much headway since then, that doesn't seem like the biggest sort of downside of lobbying. But I might be wrong.
It's good perspective. Thanks for adding that. Next question, and this came up in some of the comments around engaging your board. So someone asked advice for boards and their role and tendency to be risk averse.
I can jump in first, but happy to have other folks jump in too, just because I had talked about boards. I think it depends at what point you are in your advocacy journey, right? So if you're just starting out, you definitely want to create that culture, so you want to get them on side. And what that usually means is like, what are the rules? How would we be impacted? Sort of doing that initial review or thinking about what the advocacy strategy could be. And if you have a really risk-averse group, as Nicole said, there's a lot of stuff you can do that doesn't necessarily require talking to elected officials right away, or doing that like traditional lobbying government relations work. And most of the time, organizations are already doing that. And so just sort of doing that initial, like bringing folks on board by giving them the information, doing the risk analysis, all of those pieces really helps. And then for long term, once it becomes a culture, I mean, you're recruiting for your board. So recruit people that understand it and are not risk averse, right? I think that's another really great strategy to use. And give them time. So oftentimes right before, if it's like 3 months from the writ dropping, we'll get folks emailing, I want to get my board on board. And we're like, well, it's a bit, very fast to do that. It takes boards a long time with meetings and approvals and all those sorts of things. So starting small is really great. Another thing that I've seen that's actually really cool is that there'll be an advocacy committee on the board that is like leading stuff. And I've also seen here out in Toronto, the board chairs of big housing providers sit on an advocacy committee together and do advocacy. So there's a lot of ways to get the board engaged as well that might speak to their expertise.
Thanks, Pamela. Lots of.
I would say on the low risk side, where we talked about, the lobbying and election acts are highly prescriptive. On the ITA, CRA compliance side, we just don't want to be partisan. I appreciate there's nuance, but there's ways to work through that. There's so much you can do. And one of the ways, so you might be doing a lot of it already. Like, so for example, a lot of boards might say, well, we want to do advocacy, but we don't have the budget for a policy person. We don't have that. Well, why don't some of the other advocacy, and maybe a way to sell it to the boards is it's profile raising for your it's profile building for your organization. So it helps. You can take, like, let's say you're doing a research paper, you're serving people in the community and you have some data points, using AI to be like, can we do a marketing strategy around this to share the messaging? Like, how can we engage the public on social media or our website through different channels around the work that we're doing? And that can be a form of advocacy that you can start with and scale, but it's on a pure fact, like it's profile building and can attract donors. So it can persuade your board that you're effectively, killing two birds with one stone. You're raising your profile to raise your presence, your visibility among the donor base, but you're also sharing the good message that you're doing, and you can go from there.
Thanks, Nicole. We may not, I'm going to try and get through all the rest of the questions. We may not, though, but I'm just going to keep going. So the next question, how do charities navigate advocacy when they're nonpartisan, but their values or their positions, so just the mission, right, of their organization, align with specific partisan platforms or campaign platforms? So wondering about that both between elections and during campaigns. And this person commented, thinking about the comments made, I think, Pamela, around polarization. So any insights on how regulators are dealing with this across the not-for-profit and charitable sector?
I mean, we review campaigns and public messaging for clients where they're concerned about that. I gave the example where it's your historical position. Just because a party picks it up or a candidate picks it up doesn't de facto make you partisan. So I'm less concerned about that just because a party but it's all in how you phrase it. So we work with clients to like adjust the language sometimes. And it takes a little bit of, maybe run it through if you have some public messaging, like run it through AI. Like, is there a different way to say this that doesn't suggest we're trying to persuade people to vote a certain way, or those subtleties that you can if you can eliminate from the messaging goes a long way. So try to wordsmith what you're saying to make it so it's as neutral as possible, but impactful at the same time. And I think there's a way to do that.
That's great. Thank you.
I would add on that CRA is going to be looking at the purpose for which you're taking a position, and they're going to look at sort of background on that. So if you're taking a social change position that advances your charitable purposes, that's going to be fine, at least on the basis of the CRA policy, even if it aligns with some party. What's not going to be fine, though, is if CRA comes in and your internal documents have people emailing back and forth or messaging back and forth saying, we want to make sure we align with such and such a party. Not all that likely anybody's going to do that, but what I've seen in practice are people messaging back and forth saying, well, I really hope that so-and-so gets elected because that will help our cause. Those sorts of internal comments will be either read accurately by CRA or misread by CRA, depending on how you want to characterize it, as showing that you have a partisan political purpose, even though what you're saying in public is something you're allowed to say.
Mm-hmm.
That's helpful. Thank you. Thank you both for those that context. I'm going to squeeze in one last question. Is there any lobbying or advocacy campaigns happening right now that you're particularly interested in or excited to watch from a sector perspective? So maybe I'll turn to Prairie or Pam, but also, yeah, Nicole, I know on the charity law side.
For me, I think there's been a long time advocacy by the Bayana Foundation for a national nonprofit recognition day. So that's one that I've always kind of been paying attention to. And I know, we have our provincial sort of recognition day campaigns too. So, I think that's one that I think we will connect us all and sort of show our strength. So that's one that I've got.
Thanks, Prairie. All right, we are at time and I want to be respectful of that. So thank you to our panelists so much. This has been so insightful and informative. Hopefully to everyone who's able to attend today, that this has helped to increase your understanding of how nonprofits can engage in advocacy. Be curious, take that first step. There's more that you can do than maybe you might think. So it's less restrictive than you think. Reach out. There's lots of us in the sector that would be willing to help. Get in touch with the organizations here. So McCarthy Tetro, Imagine Canada, Vantage Point, or ONN. Again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everyone who took the time to attend today, who shared their thoughts and their questions. McCarthy Tetro, Nicole, Robert, thank you for sponsoring today's panel discussion. That is very appreciated. We will be sending out this recording by email soon, so keep an eye out for that. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.